Hello, thank you for watching Taxpayer Alert. Taxpayer Alert is sponsored by the Calaveras County Taxpayer Association. I am its president, and I'll be your host this evening. And we have many wonderful guests that know something. We don't know very much, but we learn a lot on this program. This evening, our guest is Rebecca Callen, County Auditor for Calaveras County. Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Rebecca, you've been our auditor for a while now.
Yes.
And how long's it been?
This is my second term, so I'm into my 5th year of being auditor controller for the county.
Well, you're doing a wonderful job. Our taxpayers really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And now, what's your feelings about, I know you put an awful lot of time in your job. How is this affecting your family and other things that you're doing? You're also, your family's running a business at the same time.
Yes.
And so you have you're a very busy lady.
I am busy. I definitely, and my husband understands this, I have a tendency to put work first. Mm-hmm. So, you know, sometimes it's a struggle for sure, but that's just how I am. So I take my job very seriously, and I know that I'm working for the people, and I know that I need to be a good steward and ensure that our county is being a good steward of public funds. So that's what my primary focus is on.
Well, we taxpayers appreciate that. Now, one of the things that's going on now is our budget, and I understand that we have a budget gap, and tell us a little bit about what's happening with this budget gap.
So the good news is that our budget gap is shrinking. You know, if you recall, just not that long ago, a few years ago, we were looking at the potential for an $8 million budget gap.
Yeah, remember that. Yeah.
Yes. So what we did is we worked with departments and actually did budget reductions. And then we were also looking at some revenue opportunities, doing more collection opportunities on grants and charges for services and things that we do at the county that we may have been undercharging for. So between that, our properties are coming up in terms of assessed value a little bit each year. That has helped shore up that gap to an existing, we're looking at about a $3.1 million gap between revenues and expenditures for this next fiscal year. So, you know, the good news is it was shrinking, but we still have a little ways to go before that's completely eradicated. Our expenditures are continuing to increase at a higher rate than our revenues are increasing. So that's going to be a really telling scenario on how our revenues are going to act this next fiscal year.
What's the cause of the revenue, the expenses increasing?
Well, we don't have a lot of control on our expenditures. Our biggest expenditure is our employees. So those are, for the most part, contractual agreements. Those are union contracts that were agreed to long before I probably was ever in the workforce, and have continued to grant benefits and wages associated with that. So we have the contracts that we're in. We are in CalPERS. So we don't control those pension benefits or the costs of those benefits. We're in a pool. And so when those bills come, we just have to pay them. So, you know, when that much of our costs are continuing to increase, it's going to be really hard to make those ends meet unless we have some substantial revenue. We have some pretty good benefits at the county. I'm also a business owner, so, and I've come from the private sector. So a $15 an hour employee in the private sector does not cost the same as a $15 an hour employee in the public sector, because on top of that $15 in the public, for the county, you have PERS benefits and health benefits and long-term disability benefits. You have longevity that you might be paying on top of that. You have annual compensation increases every single year for 5 years. That doesn't come in the private sector. So it costs a lot more for that same employee in the county than it would in private sector. So I do recognize that. So we're trying to figure out, maybe a better way of going around that. But at this point, without negotiations, we don't really have control over that.
I understand that some of the people involved with the negotiations are also part of the system that that they benefit from, and even though they may not make decisions that are hurtful to the taxpayer, so they benefit, it has kind of it appears to be that. And
I believe you may have brought that up at the budget hearings, that our Board of Supervisors is actually voting on compensation changes that they then in turn accept for themselves. Yes, and that is a fact. What we do make sure of is that our Board of Supervisors cannot embrace a compensation or benefit that is in excess of anything that the rest of the employees are getting.
Right.
Because there is a benefit out there that the board actually did vote on several years ago that only the electeds get. And I am going to probably be talking to the administrative office and the board of possibly ending that, putting a sunset on that.
Right.
We're here as public servants, so I don't think we should continue to get benefits after we retire in terms of compensation outside of the pension system. So we'll be kind of looking at that. But yeah, so one of the suggestions was maybe have their salaries tied to some sort of system that isn't controlled by the county would probably be a good idea.
I understand some communities tie it to the judges' salaries.
Some percentage, yeah.
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 Well, that sounds like a good idea. Our taxpayer group would like to support that. Could you be more clear on the nature of the benefits that the former supervisors voted for themselves?
Well, what it was is the electeds got together and they brought forth it's a retirement stipend. And so it's $400 a month that they would get. So it's a total of like $4,800 a year that they would get cash. And it would last until, I think, until they turned 62. But it was basically a gap between if someone was to retire at 55 until 65. So you could get this benefit for 10 years after you retired. And it's dependent on how many terms that you ran. And how many terms you successfully ran, actually. Yeah. So I did make the argument, because we did have a couple of supervisors that had retired and they wanted that benefit, and we did not give them the benefit because we deemed that even if it was the intention of the Board of Supervisors to get that benefit, it fell kind of in the face of what the intention of the law was, which that would be a benefit of greater cost than what anyone else would get. Yeah. So all of the elected department heads that have retired do qualify for it. So there is an additional cost even after an elected department head retires. So we try to stay away from things like that because that's not a real transparent benefit for the taxpayer.
Well, that's good. Well, the more sunshine we have, the better. Yeah. And that means the taxpayers won't be hurt.
Yep.
Or at least not hurt as much.
Yep.
The size of the budget and the general fund portion, there's a relationship there. What are we having?
What's going to be going to the Board of Supervisors this next Tuesday, based on what was discussed at the budget hearings a couple weeks ago, is a $129 million budget, and that's a county-wide budget. And of that $129 million, $41.7 million roughly is the general fund. And that's important because that means that about 32% of the total county budget is the general fund. And I think that where there's a lot of confusion is we always talk about the general fund and we always spend the most time on the general fund.
You control it.
We control it, but I don't think everybody quite realizes what that means. The general fund is the sheriff's department, it's the district attorney, it's probation, it's the clerk recorder, the auditor controller, the treasurer, county council, administration, the board of supervisors. It's a huge, it's a majority of our public services is the general fund. And then outside of that, you have your non-general fund departments, health and human services, the public works department, air pollution, and some of our board-governed special districts. So it's important to understand that there is a funding difference between the total county budget and the general fund. And the general fund is where any of the discretionary dollars that we have, the board has discretion over those. So I think sometimes the misnomer is the public looks at the budget and they say, well, wait a minute, you have $129 million to spend here. Why can't we have more libraries? Why can't we have more deputies? Why can't we have more, auditors? I don't know. And the reality is, of that $41.7 million, there's really only about $17.5 million of discretionary funding in there that's controlled entirely by the Board of Supervisors. So that's not a ton. It's about 42%. And that money comes from property taxes, sales tax, or transient occupancy tax, vehicle license fees. And that's it. There's not a ton of revenue that the board has discretion over. Most of the revenue that we have that is providing for services for our county is state, federal, and restricted funding that can only be used for specific programs.
Right. I understand of the $41 million, maybe half of that is for law enforcement.
About half, almost half of it is for public safety. And so public safety is not just the sheriff's department, it's also the district attorney's office and probation, the public defender, the jail. So it's all of those public safety components, which, yes, it's about 50%.
Looking back over, since you've been on board, what's the pattern been on the general fund? Is it getting bigger, or is it about the same? Is it a curve that's going upward, or is it a straight line?
It's getting bigger. It is getting bigger. We did go through a period of time where we really tried to shrink the general fund because we had lost a significant. It was a catastrophic revenue loss. So
property value loss.
Yes. So we did have to really rein everything in, and so now we're rebounding. It's a very slow rebound, but we are getting larger again. So we are seeing where our personnel was down under 500. Now we are going up over 500 in terms of number of full-time personnel.
Sometimes communities, maybe not so much in California, but elsewhere, try to contract out in the hopes of saving money and improving service, especially when the system gets really bogged down and they lose efficiency. But I understand it's kind of difficult in California because the union influence tends to want to prevent that.
There's several issues. So there's the labor issue where we can't swap out activities that could have been done by an employee with a contractor. If that work had been previously done by an employee, there would be a labor issue. In addition, there are laws on the books in California that we cannot directly compete with the private sector. And so there's just things that we can't do by law. And it doesn't really matter if we were a charter county or a non-charter county.
Right.
There's just some things that we can't do. But if we don't have the expertise, we don't have employees that can do the work, we don't have the expertise on staff to do certain pieces of work, then we can contract out for those things.
I understand that cities such as Sonora and Angels Camp contract out for their planning.
And in the cities have a little bit different rules. There's a little bit more leniency on what the cities can actually do. They have a lot more control on what they can do than the counties do. But the cities also, there have been times even at the county where we actually had to contract out for plan review and certain activities.
Right.
Several years ago. And that was just because we didn't have enough staff in order to do the work that we were doing. We weren't replacing staff, but we needed to do something in order to catch up.
Yeah, augment it.
Yeah.
And I think that's when we had some large development projects, and they had to staff up for that. Well, one of the questions that going on everybody's mind, what control does the board have on these funds? And you pretty well explained, not very much.
They don't have very much control. So it's always interesting when a new supervisor starts who isn't familiar with government, because they really have this idea that they're going to come in and have a lot of control over our revenues. And we really don't have very much control over our revenues at all. No one can dictate what the property values are going to be. That's the assessor's job, and she's going to do those assessments based on the rules and requirements that the State Board of Equalization has out there in Revenue Taxation Code. In terms of charging for fees, we can only charge fees based on what our costs are. And then some of those fees that we charge are restricted. So, for instance, when the building department charges fees, those revenues can only be used for the building department. You can't take excess. Let's say they had a really good year for building permits, and let's say they ended up bringing in $200,000 more building revenue than they had expenditures. You can't take that revenue and move it over to law enforcement or move it over to the libraries. It has to stay with building. And so building has to have a plan to either update their systems or replace some of their capital costs, or they have to relook at their fee structure to ensure that they're not overcharging the public. So there's a lot of restrictions on what we can charge and what we can't charge. In addition, the Board of Supervisors has not a lot of authority on what they can waive, because if you're waiving fees, then that starts becoming a gift to public funds. So there's a lot of learning. There's a steep learning curve for board members to understand what they do and don't have control over. But when your discretionary funding is property tax, which you don't have any control over how those assessments are going to happen. Right. It's on sales tax, which you can't force a business to come here. A business is either going to come here and they're going to succeed, or they're not. Right. That's not under the control of the county. Our transient occupancy tax, this drought is going to be really telling if that's going to impact our transient occupancy tax, because if people don't come up here to vacation, that is going to cause that sales tax and that transient occupancy tax to go down.
Especially the boating vacationers that don't want to use the lakes.
Yep, so there's not a lot of control there for the board. And unfortunately, we aren't a huge sales tax-based county. We just aren't. And our transient occupancy tax is one of the lowest transient occupancy taxes in the state of California. So that is what it is.
If it weren't so serious, this would be funny. I understand our neighboring county, Tuolumne County, want to sue us because we were sending our shoppers over there on their roads to go because they had better shopping than we did, and they want to sue us for the road improvements.
To pay some of the road improvements.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That never went through, I don't think.
No.
Now, some of the things that are important, the PERS trends in our county. What's happening with CalPERS?
Well, CalPERS, because of PEPRA, which was the Pension Reform Act that passed a couple of years ago, that really was kind of one of the first major slight changes to pensions that we've ever seen. And what I think it was because of pressure from taxpayers, like you and me, saying we are pushing a debt down the road and we're not addressing it.
Right.
And we're pushing it towards our grandkids and our great-grandkids, and we're potentially going to defunct a pension system that is not going to be able to pay these employees. We're making false promises. So what they did is they've been making steps, and they've had to make multiple steps in order to try to fund that unfunded liability. Yeah. And so they got together and decided, well, maybe that discount rate that they were using was a little inflated, so that had to come down. Right. Well, that correlates to the employer has to pay more. Right. Maybe people are actually living longer, which they are. Yeah. And so they had to factor that in, which means the employer has to pay more. Right. Maybe they needed to change their investment strategy, and they did, and that cost the employer more. And maybe, the
employer is a taxpayer.
And the employer is the taxpayer.
Right.
And so all of these things that they've been doing are to ultimately pay the unfunded liability down, but it all translates to a higher cost to the employer. And the more we are paying for pension, the less service that we can provide. Because for, at this point, at this very moment, for a non-safety employee, for every dollar of pay that we give them, earnings, we have to pay, the employer has to pay another 16 cents on top of that. And that 16 cents is going to continue to increase 1 to 2% every single year for the next 5 years. So we're going to see a 22 to 24% of every dollar that we pay to an employee. We're going to have to pay CalPERS 24 cents on top of that.
So that goes to former employees.
That goes to pay for the former employees or current employees that have not yet retired yet, but were in the existing system, not under the pension reform system, to pay for their retirement. And so when you're talking about that 24 cents, that's 24 cents that you can't use to pay for current services. Right. It's to pay for pension. Safety is a bigger issue because if you recall several years ago, the safety employees, including fire personnel as well, and this isn't just Calaveras County, this was a huge nationwide change. They decided to do a 3% at 50 retirement benefit, which was very expensive. And so we will actually see those rates. Right now we're paying about 39 cents for every dollar. We'll see that increase to about 46 cents.
What does 3% at 50 mean?
It means that if you worked for, say, I think it's if you work 25 years and you retired at 50, you'd get about 90% of your pay. You get 3% of your last highest pay times the number of years that you worked.
Oh, okay. So if you work 25 years, you take 3% of your highest, okay, and then it comes up to be a figure that's going to be a little bit less than
it's less than 100%, but it can be as high as 90%.
Okay, I understand that.
So it's a very rich benefit. Yeah. But someone has to pay for that.
Right. That's the taxpayer.
That's taxpayer. So under PEPRA, that 3% at 50 no longer exists. So under pension reform, that no longer exists. So even safety is having to work longer. Non-safety are having to work longer. So that even the 55-year-old retirement isn't 55 anymore. You have to work longer.
Is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, theoretically, assuming that CalPERS assumptions are correct and assuming that the rates that we pay are actually going to be paying down the unfunded liability, at some point, well down the road, there won't be an unfunded liability. That's, I guess, the light at the end of the tunnel. Okay. And theoretically, assuming the assumptions are correct, any new employees entering the system, the pension system, are supposed to be fully funded from the moment that they start employment all the way through to when they retire. So that's the theory. I think time will tell. I feel and I see that there's still a little bit of a shortfall there, but we'll see it eventually.
It seems like it would be right that the retirement system would be controlled and owned by the employees and the retirees, because it's really their money. And it seems like the politicians shouldn't be messing with it. And it's simple thinking, I know. But if we could move toward where it'd be totally, the retirement system be totally independent of the employer once the employee leaves, and they could make money or not make money or do as they wish, it seemed like that would be the fairest approach for the taxpayer.
Which is what you generally see in the private sector.
Yeah.
It's your decision to invest in some sort of compensation plan, and you're going to ride the market just like everybody else does.
Right.
That is the true difference between public and private sector with regards to retirements. What we are doing at the county and have been doing is we do have a deferred compensation plan. It's just not utilized as much as I think it should be. So we're going to be working with the employees and educating them on the deferred compensation plan so that there is an opportunity for them to look at alternatives to CalPERS. And we're just going to have to wait and see at this point with CalPERS. It's kind of like we're too thick in it to completely pull out of it. Our total asset value in CalPERS, safety and non-safety, is it's over $67 million.
Oh, that's not chicken feed.
No, and we have a $3.1 million budget gap that we're filling in with one-time funds.
Oh.
So it's not really something that we can just pull out. And the total unfunded liability that we have right now is just over $47 million. So in order for us to, even fathom coming out of CalPERS,
right,
we have to figure out how to shore that up. And at this point, we are just having to make payments to CalPERS to whittle away that unfunded liability based on the assumptions that they're giving to their board.
What a job. I'm glad I'm not a supervisor. Looking ahead, going back to the light at the end of the tunnel, I suppose paying down that unfunded liability has to be done, and we have to hope that we can stop this increase, the disparity between public employees and private sector. It used to be that public employees made less, but they had more security. Now they have more security and they get more.
Yes.
And
yes.
So something needs to be done there. I'm not sure how that can happen because of the political influences.
That's a tough one because, like I said, a lot of these are set in contracts that were established a long time ago. We've been in CalPERS since well before I was born, and to kind of undo all of this, it's going to be really, really, really slow. Yeah.
Well, Rebecca, I'm so delighted. This is the second time on our program. And this is actually the third or fourth time I've seen you talk, and it's always learned so much.
Thank you.
And you're so enjoyable to be with.
Thank you.
Thank you for being our guest.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Taxpayer Alert. We'll see you next time.